Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Miranda DeBazio, a former GW cross country and track runner, three-time Atlantic 10 champion, GW record holder. From everybody at LRT Sports, I want to say thank you for sitting down with me today and giving your insights. It'll be a huge resource to the young athlete community, so thank you again. Running is associated with a really specific, usually thin body type, and there's kind of the inaccurate perception that skinny equals fast within the running community, especially among younger runners. And this sort of leads to a prevalence in eating disorders and unhealthy body images among runners. So I was wondering what your experience has been with this, and if you've had struggles, when did they begin, and how has that affected you mentally and physically? Sorry, that's kind of a handful, but if you can break it down.
No, I mean it's a great question, and it really this idea of having a certain body type or physique for a certain sport is a huge issue. Sadly, not only within the running community, right? Think of several other sports that have this certain aesthetic that is tied to what people believe that athlete has to attain in order to perform well, and it's really just a myth, right? We know from research that somebody's not going to perform better just because their body looks a certain way. It's going to be based off of how they're, training and how they're fueling and all of these things. But so it's a great question. But my own experience really began in high school. So I did struggle a lot with body image, disordered eating, and then an eating disorder. But it really started in high school. I would say at the very tail end of my high school career. I was a very late bloomer, as many athletes are, but I really hadn't hit puberty until my senior year of high school, and it was right around that time when my body was starting to change that I became very fearful of that change, because like so many, right, I was identified by the fact that I lived in a very, very small body and I performed well with running. So that became who I was, right? This little girl that was really good at running. And that body type played a huge role in my identity. So as my body started to change, I really started to fight that change. And wanted to do that in any way possible. And I really just fell down this rabbit hole of the idea that I had to start restricting the foods that I would eat. It started very innocent in a way, right? Like cutting out some sweets or cutting out refined carbohydrates, right? Like very small things, and then it just spiraled very, very quickly. So as I entered into the college scene of running, where my volume of exercise and running and the intensity grew astronomically, right? So we're talking like going from 30 miles a week of running to 60 to 70 pretty quickly. So a huge jump in volume. So obviously my energy expenditure was skyrocketing, and I just kept restricting and restricting and restricting. I when I reflect on my experience, I'm very, very fortunate to not have felt pressure from my coach, not to have felt pressure from my parents or my peers to, engage in these behaviors and these dietary behaviors, which is a really unique experience. Sadly, a lot of athletes tend to be pressured to, again, attain these physiques or eat a certain way because their coaches tell them that's how they're going to perform better, right? Or their parents want them to be, those scholarship athletes, and they say this is how you should do it, right? Because everybody thinks they know what's right, and so again, I'm very fortunate that that wasn't my case. A lot of it was this internal pressure that I had, really created for myself. Um, but I just unfortunately went down, again, the wrong path, right? I didn't take the path of education. I wanted to do it myself, right? I wanted to do the solo act and not reach out for help. So it began really in my early or my later end of high school and kind of weaved into my college career. And it really didn't didn't become something that I thought was a problem until I became seriously injured my senior year of college. So it was probably a good 5 years that I really struggled with these things. And it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until I sustained a really severe stress fracture that completely took me out of the game for several years. That I really had to, draw attention to these issues. But in hindsight, obviously, I would never have the perspective or the passion for doing what I do now if I hadn't had the experiences that I have had in the past. So I guess a little bit of a silver lining there, but yes, this is definitely something that I've struggled with, and sadly, it does affect many athletes, and like you said, especially young athletes, because those resources sometimes aren't always there for us to get the education that we need to make sure that we're taking the healthiest avenue for improving our sport performance, rather than, again, buying into these ideas and things that again, not only our sport touts as how we become better, right, but our society. Sadly, we live in a society where a thinner body is admired and is seen as the ideal beautiful body, right? So it's kind of this twofold issue when it comes to athletes, right? Because they're, not only sustaining pressure from their sport specific environment, but they're also sustaining, these general societal pressures that everybody faces, right? So it's kind of like a double whammy, and it can be really, really tough to navigate, but it really emphasizes the importance of that education, that knowledge that we need to make sure that not only our athletes, but our coaches and our other sports stakeholders have.
Right. Like you bring up this sort of like education as something super important, which I really like is a huge part of telling your story. So, talking about recovery and post, and importantly, your message to young athletes, what sort of resources and recommendations do you have with young athletes of all sorts struggling with this sort of issue? And what sort of advice do you have for prevention and maybe recovery for people that have already sort of dealt with some of those issues?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and this is something that, again, I kind of touched on, but I did not do this in my personal experience. And I think, wow, how different would my experience had been if I had done this? And that is reach out for professional help, right? So I wanted to become a better athlete. And instead of going to my coach or going to a sport dietitian who's going to be, your number one, not one of the number one people in your arena that you want to have helping you and guiding you with regard to nutrition for optimal performance. And so I think seeking that professional help is the number one thing that any person can do, right? If maybe if they're not really quite ready yet, again, going to somebody who's a little bit closer, like a coach or a peer, somebody that they can talk to and open up about their experiences, that's going to be huge. But it's going to have the most impact if they can get the professional help, right? And I think the great thing about the time that we live in now really is where I think a lot of people are finally starting to destigmatize mental disorders, right? And an eating disorder is a mental disorder, right? There's a whole spectrum, obviously from disordered eating to eating disorders that are clinically diagnosed, right? So there's a little bit of a blurred line there. But there's again, tons of people that are coming out saying it's okay to reach out for help. And that professional help is going to be really the key to recovery. And the sooner you can start working with these professionals, the better. Sometimes, again, it can take people a really long time to get to that point where they're comfortable, but so I always say it's great to start with somebody that you are comfortable with, right? If that's parents and coaches and peers, and you hope that they're going to help you navigate some of that maybe uncertainty, and direct you towards the healthier outcomes, right? And not push you into the opposite, right? So there you want to hope that those people are going to be there for you to guide you, and to really help you get to the difficult point of, sitting down with a professional. But there are several other, resources, I think, too, that are, again, not professionals, but that are communities that are really, they're really amplifying these, voices of athletes and the concern for the athlete's health, as the, most important part, right? So not the performance, not what the athlete looks like, right, but their overall health. And that was part of why I created my website, Striding for Balance. So it's supposed to be an educational resource, but that also, again, really helps these athletes, their parents, their coaches kind of navigate some of these issues. And I do list several other resources, including, so one is Strong Runner Chicks. I've been a part of this group for several years now, and they do a lot to really promote, again, healthy dietary behaviors, really, again, demystifying that idea that a thinner body is going to equal a faster body, right? And they have tons of wonderful resources on their website, through their social media. Another one is Lane 9 Project. They do a very similar thing, but they're actually based in Washington, D.C. So I've had a chance to really meet and discuss a lot of these issues in person with that group, and they're doing wonderful things. A book that's going to be a great resource, it's not available yet, but it will be, is from Melody Fairchild. She was one of America's best distance runners as a high school athlete, and she has such a fresh perspective on these issues, having come from, dealing with some of these herself, right? And so she is actually publishing a book called Girls Running, and it's exactly what we need. It's an educational resource for girls, for their parents, and for their coaches. What we'll need next is one for men, or boys, because we know that they are not immune to these issues. That's an area of research that is really picking up as well. But yeah, those are some of the resources that come to mind right off the top of my head. But there's tons of great resources, and I think a lot of each of those resources can lead you to even more resources, right? So so there's a heavy amount of literature if you're wanting to dive into like really science heavy research, looking at these issues. But there's, again, tons of blogs and things that are really helping to support these athletes and, again, build that foundation from a young age, that the ultimate goal is to have longevity in the sport, right? And really have your full health, right? Because we know that there's a lot of health consequences, not only obviously psychological consequences, but physiological consequences of underfueling, and it, overtraining. So it is so important that, again, we lay that groundwork for young athletes.
Right, and I know you just mentioned a lot of helpful things, but just as a final parting question, is there any other pieces of advice you want to give to young athletes in general, just regarding all features of health, mental, physical?
Yeah, I think that really the biggest piece of advice that I can give is never be afraid to reach out for help. I know that it can be really hard and really tough to talk about some of these issues, especially if you're somebody who's struggling with them. But it's so important to, again, have that community, have that conversation with the people that you love, whether that's friends, family, anybody. And I think that's again a huge part of the recovery process. But it's not only healing yourself, it's healing others. Opening up these conversations, you tend to find that you're really not alone, right? Again, just as everybody has these societal pressures to look a certain way, you'll find that almost every single athlete has had some form of thought or experience that may have led them to believe something about their body weight or their shape or their appearance. And so opening up that conversation, again, is not only going to help you, but may help a teammate or a friend. And so it's really important that you have those conversations. But I think that's, that, and just really, again, keeping in mind what's the ultimate goal. And I think the ultimate goal should always be the health of the athlete and the person, their longevity in the sport. Like I said, really making sure that they're taking care of their bodies so then they can run or do their activity for the rest of their life, right? So then it doesn't just have the timeline of 4 years in high school and 4 years in college. So I think that's two pieces of advice. But I think another thing that if I could tell myself when I was younger, right, would be don't be afraid to let your body change. Don't be afraid of hitting puberty, getting your menstrual cycle, right? Like these things that I was so terrified of because I was worried they were going to alter my performance in a negative way. And I think it's so important for young female athletes to hear that those, those things are not markers for your performance decreasing, right? If anything, they're just making you better, right? They're making your body more resilient, stronger. They're totally normal processes that the female body should go through, and it's what makes us uniquely female. And it's just they're such important physiological processes. So I think that's something that I would love to encourage other young female athletes to remember, and encourage them to be proud of that part of themselves, right? And remember that, our records for all kinds of, any kinds of performance, right? This is one of the most profound things that I was ever told is like records are held by women, not by girls, right? So their bodies changed. They developed into these strong, really, really resilient women, and that's how they've become record holders and champions. So those are, again, I think I would say the last things that I would say are really important to emphasize.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot of that information is just extremely important for young athletes. So I really enjoy your perspective. And from everybody at LRT Sports, I want to say thank you for these answers today. Thanks.